Just a little more than a year ago, on January 6th, 2021, a terrible event gave us a huge shock to our system. I think it especially frightened us as Unitarian Universalists because our abiding commitment to democratic processes, a commitment we have chosen to memorialize in our fifth UU principle. It all occurred because a segment of our nation's population could not muster the moral fortitude to do the right thing. Many of the same people who failed us on and around January 6th stepped up this past week to lionize the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. They quoted him and told us how patriotic his unwavering commitment to freedom was, but they didn't really mean it. What does it mean truly to do the right thing? At this time of year, when King's words are fresh on our minds, I often answer this question with a story about someone who did the right thing. And he did it simply because it was the right thing to do. It's a story from the great civil rights movement of the 1960s. King and John Lewis and Bull Connor all figure in this story, but it's not about them. It's about a man you've probably never heard of doing the right thing. We still have much to learn from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., especially the precepts of nonviolent protest. King learned this principle from Gandhi, and it was the hallmark of the American civil rights movement. But it took more than nonviolence for the movement to succeed as far as it did. It took many people inside the movement, as was John Lewis, and outside the movement too. My story is about an outsider to the movement. Perhaps it can inspire us as we are radically challenged yet again to do the right thing in the face of adversity. And let me warn you, it's a somewhat lengthy story, so please get comfortable and take a listen. The civil rights movement witnessed great ongoing frustration, even as it gained momentum from the close of World War II. This frustration did not prevent Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. from persevering as the steadfast, archetypal leader of the movement in this country. Overt racism and oppression proved to be intransigent, not just in the South, but all over our nation. And any claim that there is no residual racism, that discrimination is history, is certainly wrong. We've had altogether too many reminders of that recently, from apparent racist police actions to state legislatures using the phony argument of rampant voter fraud to revive new Jim Crow-like suppression of minority votes. King knew in his heart that racism would not end in his lifetime. He had hopes that racism would crumble and dissolve within the lifetimes of his children. But that too is most unlikely. Beyond the media, many outsiders abetted the civil rights movement, happenstance, enmeshed them within the movement. And they helped not because of their connection to it, but because it was the right thing to do. We might characterize this as respecting the rule of law and the inherent worth and dignity of all people. But it's also connected to our sixth principle: peace, liberty, and justice for all. My story is about a white man from Alabama named Floyd Mann, M-A-N-N, Floyd Mann. You've probably never heard of it. It was the spring of 1961. We had a new president, and his brother was Attorney General. The Freedom Rides began on southern bus routes. The objective, to integrate public interstate transportation, particularly the bus system, about the only mode of transportation most oppressed Blacks could afford. Using regularly scheduled buses, the Freedom Riders first rode out of Nashville to Atlanta. There they dined with the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights leaders. But they were headed next into Alabama, a far more militantly segregated state than Georgia was. In Anniston, the bus was savagely attacked by Klansmen, their families in tow, as if they were attending a church picnic. The bus was able to limp out of town only to be stopped and set afire. The Freedom Riders were certain that they were about to die, either in the fire or clubbed to death if they tried to escape the inferno. Fortuitously, the bus's gas tank exploded, sending Klansmen scurrying and allowing the riders a brief chance to escape the flames. As they gasped for fresh air, the mob surged back to attack them. But an Alabama state trooper had been among the passengers as an undercover observer. He pulled his gun, announced his identity, and so saved that first busload of Freedom Riders. Actually, he was acting under orders to collect information about the riders, to monitor ties between local police and the Klan, and to prevent bloodshed if possible. The trooper was planted on the bus by Floyd Mann, Alabama's Commissioner of Public Safety. Mann feared the worst, and he was determined to suppress the violence he saw coming. Floyd Mann had been a small town cop in eastern Alabama. He was tapped by his lifelong friend, Governor John Patterson, to be Commissioner of Public Safety. Floyd was undereducated, and it often showed. He once said that he could hire new state troopers in spite of budget cutbacks through nutrition. Of course, he meant attrition. He'd been brought up simply by his parents, who instilled in him that he should treat all people alike, black or white. Man liked to say that he was a lawman, nothing more, nothing less. Yet he clearly had a strong sense of justice. He once told a reporter about his concern that police work attracted too many people who wanted a job where they could act out their meanness. The rise of the Klan troubled Floyd Mann greatly, but he was no integrationist. He merely wanted no gratuitous violence. Mann told a reporter years later, "I wasn't involved in that," referring to the political objectives of the Freedom Riders. He was, in his words, trying to make sure nothing happened to those people while they were in Alabama. Now, the Freedom Riders were just getting started. A group rode from Nashville to Birmingham, but was met outside Birmingham by the infamous Bull Connor. That memorable bigot was Birmingham Police Commissioner at the time, more powerful than the mayor. He boarded the bus outside his jurisdiction and promptly arrested two young men, one black and one white, for sitting together. Connor rode the bus into the Birmingham bus station. One of the riders, John Lewis, later became head of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, or SNCC, as we used to call it. He looked out and saw more reporters than civil rights activists had ever seen before. Lewis was gratified. They were beginning to attract the attention that they needed. The media presence helped minimize violence that spring day in Birmingham. Connor sent regular passengers on their way while keeping the Freedom Riders on the bus, the windows covered, for several hours, perhaps hoping that some of the reporters would grow tired and leave. The group was finally arrested and taken to the infamous Birmingham jail. John Siegenthaler had been a reporter for the Nashville Tennessean before Attorney General Robert Kennedy hired him as his personal assistant. As about the only trusted person with firsthand knowledge of Southern politics, Siegenthaler was sent to Birmingham to seek the release of the Freedom Riders whom Connor had arrested. When he got there, Connor merely laughed at him. But Connor did release all the riders, thinking that by escorting them back to the Tennessee-Alabama line, they would either go back to Nashville or the Klan would get hold of them. Yet those escorted out in the middle of the night quickly regrouped and headed back to Birmingham, reinforced by new Freedom Riders on the way via train. Attorney General Kennedy ordered Siegenthaler to Montgomery, the capital, to negotiate the safety of the Freedom Riders with Governor John Patterson. Siegenthaler felt very alone in Patterson's office that morning. However tentatively the feds were becoming involved. With Confederate flags behind him and flanked by several of his cabinet officers, Governor Patterson railed against Siegenthaler for his impudence, for even contemplating the idea of federal meddling in his domain. Siegenthaler reminded the governor of the bloody confrontation in Anniston only a few days before. If the state could not protect the Freedom Riders, he said, then federal help was there for the asking. Patterson finally said, pointing to a small, ordinary man seated near him, "This is my public safety commissioner, and he can't protect them. Tell him, Floyd." Floyd Mann replied, "Governor, I'm Commissioner of Safety. I'm your appointee. If you tell me to protect these people, then I'll protect them. Everyone in the room was stunned into silence. Governor Patterson's script was in tatters. Everyone leaned away from this man who refused to play out the little cliche scene that Patterson had scripted. Man had already demonstrated that he could and would do the right thing. That he had no qualms about telling everybody else all about that right thing. In a startled voice, Patterson said condescendingly to his boyhood chum, "Floyd, I don't believe you understood what you just said. I said you couldn't protect them, and you said you could." Then Patterson asked a question you would quickly regret. Can you explain how you would do that? A simple plan already existed. Man answered, "I'd put the highway patrol in front of the bus, a couple of cars if need be, and the highway patrol behind it, and have a helicopter and an airplane overhead, and some additional highway patrol cars at the ready." Patterson sat silent, and stunned. Hiding his elation, Siegenthaler asked, "Can you do it without federal help?" Floyd Mann answered, "I can do it without anyone's help." Regaining his composure, Patterson realized he was boxed in and ordered that within city jurisdictions, the city police would be in charge. He too knew full well about connections between Klan and police. Floyd Mann would do what he could, short of being insubordinate to his boss. Sort of. Siegenthaler thought the Freedom Riders' safety was resolved, at least in Alabama, only Mississippi and Louisiana to go. Yet Robert Kennedy, too, was being boxed in. He sought to protect his brother from unseemly meddling in state issues, while the responsibility to prevent gratuitous violence crystallized at the same time. The bus company, Greyhound, felt the pinch too. Drivers refused the planned Freedom Rider trip from Birmingham to Montgomery, a 90-mile drive down US Highway 31, unless Greyhound officials would sit in the front seats. They did. The riders boarded the bus early that Saturday morning, May 20th, 1961. The trip out of Birmingham and down the highway to Montgomery was slow because a lengthy convoy had developed. Not only were Floyd Mann's highway patrol cars with air cover on the road, but dozens of media vehicles went along too. As they pulled into town, downtown Montgomery was eerily quiet, deserted. In those pre-mall days, Saturday morning in any downtown area would have been busy. They cruised by the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. It had been Martin Luther King Jr.'s parish 6 years earlier when the Montgomery bus boycott had vaulted him into national prominence. It turned out that the Montgomery cops had worked a deal with the Klan. That's why it was deserted. People knew to stay away. It was an ambush. Reporters crowded the bus station lots, and the Freedom Riders, as they got off the bus, realized they were being charged by a huge mob, and all hell broke loose. The cops had agreed not to move into the area until the Klan had 15 minutes for whatever mayhem they chose. Freedom Rider John Lewis was the first to get off the bus in order to read a statement to the media. He saw the mob of angry men and women wielding bats and pipes and clubs. They began to beat the reporters. He saw them beginning to wail on the NBC team and correspondent Herb Kaplow. The mob was trying to take out the witnesses first. Lewis shouted at his comrades, "Stand together, don't run." He knew this was their only chance. Lewis and Jim Zwerg, a white Freedom Rider, seemed to be singled out for particularly violent attention. Both thought they would soon be dead. Lewis prayed. From nowhere, a small man came up, pulling his gun from his shoulder holster. Floyd Mann fired 2 shots in the air and shouted, "There will be no killing here today." The rage slowly began to subside. Mann had suspected something like this would happen. Both he and Governor Patterson knew about the Klan and local cops. Mann had ordered a contingent of state troopers hidden a block away to be ready. They began to move in reluctantly, but their presence helped, even though their personal loyalties were largely with the mob. Floyd threatened them with dismissal if they failed to follow his orders. Pockets of mayhem persisted for a while. A group of Klansmen concerned about being identified were beating a local TV cameraman, and one burly attacker was about to crush the cameraman's skull with a baseball bat. Floyd Mann stuck his pistol in the ear of that attacker and said softly, "One more swing and you're dead." Witnesses later said Floyd Mann saved at least 3 lives that day, perhaps as many as 10. He never thought of himself as a hero. He simply thought he was doing his lawman's job as best he could. Nearby, John Siegenthaler had arrived in his rental car. He immediately came upon a young white woman, a Freedom Rider, suffering a severe beating from the mob. He interceded and tried to help her escape. This was bad enough, but he also identified himself as a federal agent, which garnered him a head blow from a pipe. He suffered a fractured skull and broken ribs, and got really only a hassle from the Montgomery police. Later, he awoke in a small Montgomery Hospital. His first visitor was a tearful Floyd man. Man thought he had failed in his promise to Siegenthaler. Siegenthaler was struck by the irony. The only decent official in the state was in tears. But the upshot was that Robert Kennedy now had a vision because of how his representative had been treated. The days of federal inaction were over, although violence in Alabama would get worse. The church bombing in Birmingham in 1963 that killed 4 little girls attending Sunday school. The Selma March in 1965. By then, Floyd Mann was no longer in charge of public safety. George Wallace was governor, and his state troopers had no qualms about beating John Lewis. We've all seen the photos. And the other Selma to Montgomery marchers at the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Life in the trenches of the civil rights movement continued, dangerous and deadly. Many, many years later, influential Congressman John Lewis of the Georgia 5th visited Montgomery to help dedicate a civil rights memorial. Someone vaguely familiar and said, holding out his hand, "You're John Lewis, aren't you? I remember you from the Freedom Rides." Lewis looked at him quizzically, and the man said, "I'm Floyd Mann." "Congratulations on your becoming a congressman." It had been 30 years. But Lewis remembered, "You saved my life," he said. They hugged each other, neither of them sure whether that was the right thing to do. A black man and a white man embracing each other in Alabama, even in the 1990s. And it was John Lewis's turn to cry. Most of us are ordinary folks. Yet we all face challenges in life to do the right thing. Let us do the things we should with a spiritual courage, with a simple commitment to what we see as morally right. The events of 2022 and beyond may not drag us into a great social movement as it did Floyd Mann. But if the universe bends toward peace, liberty, and justice for all, it is because regular people like us help it along. Let us too respond when called upon. So might that be. And amen.